At 59, Walter Harris was sure his story was winding down. Just a tired veteran, a dented delivery van, and a scarred old German shepherd who slept through his prayers. Then one rainy night, Ranger won't stop scratching at the weeds behind an old riverside warehouse until they uncover a hidden basement and a dead man's blood money meant to save the town. As buried crimes crawl back into the light, Walter has to ask, what if this isn't a curse, but the last assignment heaven ever gives him? Before you begin, help us grow by subscribing. The rain had thinned to a gray mist over Maple Hollow by the time the first bus grumbled through the valley. At the far end of the depot lot, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and then to a strip of stubborn weeds, a white delivery van sat under a leaning street lamp, its paint gone dull with age. Inside the van, Walter Harris wrapped his fingers around a paper cup of machine coffee, feeling the heat seep slowly into his stiff knuckles. 59, he thought, though some mornings his joints insisted on 70. The mirror clipped to the visor offered him the same stranger he saw every day. Medium tall and a little too lean, shoulders still broad under the red and black plaid shirt jacket he refused to give up, short gray hair cropped close around a face mapped with fine lines across his brow and at the corners of soft brown eyes that had seen too much. The cream-colored t-shirt at his collar was clean, the dark jeans faded at the knees, the brown boots polished more out of habit than vanity. He looked like any other working man in a small mountain town, he supposed. But when he met his own gaze, he didn't see Maple Hollow, or the fog hugging the pines beyond the depot fence. He saw dust and smoke and a sky the color of burned metal. A man screaming for a medic over the roar of rotating blades. The flash of a decision he would always wish he'd made differently. A soft sound in the back of the van tugged him out of the memory. A heavy body shifting on the rubber mat. The faint chuff of a sigh. He glanced over his shoulder. A large German shepherd lay there, paws tucked under his chest, ears pricked toward the world outside. The dog's coat was a blend of sable and black, the classic saddle pattern. But along one flank a few thin scars cut through the fur like pale threads. 8 years old, maybe, with the calm, measuring gaze of a creature who had also seen the worst and survived. "Morning, buddy," Walter murmured. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, soft but sure. No dramatics, no barking, just that small acknowledgement. "I'm here. We're still doing this." Walter set the cup down, checked his watch, a simple military-style piece, its face scratched but reliable on his left wrist, and slid out into the chill air. The mist beaded on his jacket as he opened the back doors and began to check the crates. Blood pressure meds for Mrs. Coleman on Cedar Lane, insulin for Mr. Ray over by the feed store, canned soup and cereal for the Sandoval sisters, who no longer drove. Maple Hollow had a clinic but no pharmacy. The county paid Walter a modest wage to make runs to the bigger town down the mountain and carry back what the older folks needed. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure wasn't big money. But every signature on his clipboard said, in its own quiet way, that somebody was glad he'd shown up. And after the war, that was more than he'd expected to have. He whistled under his breath, a low two-note sound, and the shepherd hopped gracefully out of the van, nails clicking on the damp pavement before he dropped back into a heel at Walter's side. "You know the drill," Walter said. "No jumping up on anyone unless they fall." One ear tipped sideways as if in mild amusement. The morning passed in a series of small doorways and smaller kitchens. Mrs. Coleman, a frail woman in her late 70s with wispy white hair and sharp blue eyes, insisted on pressing a warm biscuit wrapped in a napkin into Walter's hand, then another for the dog. "He's looking thin," she said, though the shepherd's ribs were solid under his double coat. You men always forget to feed yourselves. Walter smiled, ducking his head. Yes, ma'am. The dog waited until she shut the door before crunching his biscuit, crumbs sticking briefly to his whiskers. At the Sandoval house, two sisters in their 80s argued cheerfully in Spanish about whether Walter should sit for a cup of coffee. He declined as gently as he could, pointing to his schedule, to the medicines in the van that didn't care about niceties like conversation. Driving away, he felt that familiar, quiet ache in his chest. Not the sharp stab of panic, but a low tug. They all had their routines, their aches and pills and favorite shows. They needed someone to bring the outside world to their porch. For reasons he didn't entirely understand, that someone was him. And as much as the loneliness of his trailer hit hard some nights, there was a small, stubborn comfort in knowing tomorrow morning he'd have places to be. By mid-afternoon, the mist had turned to a light drizzle, threading silver through the bare branches along the river road. Walter turned the van toward the edge of town, where Maple Hollow thinned into scrub and the two-lane highway descended into the gorge. Before the drop-off, a gravel track branched toward the water, marked only by a leaning sign that once read Riverside Storage in peeling blue letters. He eased the wheel and let the van bump down the ruts. The town council had called him in the night before. A quick meeting in the back of the diner, stainless steel counters reflecting fluorescent light, the scent of coffee and fried onions clinging to everything. The council chair, a compact woman in her mid-60s named Marlene, with short steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense jawline softened by kind hazel eyes, had laid it out in plain terms. "We're short on staff, Walter," she'd said, fingers drumming lightly on a folder of papers. "The Riverside warehouse is just sitting there, while we wait on some big outfit to finish the paperwork and maybe buy it. Insurance wants someone to have eyes on it. You've got the background, you're steady, people trust you. It'd mean a little extra pay. Think you can swing by mornings and evenings? Make sure no kids break in? Nothing catches fire?" He'd caught himself glancing at the dog curled under the table at his feet, as if the shepherd might weigh in. Extra pay meant a bit more room between him and late notices. And watching over an old building by the river sounded, frankly, easier than all the things he hadn't been able to watch over before. "Yeah," Walter had said at last, voice low but firm. "I can do that." Now, as he pulled up in front of the warehouse, he rolled the memory around in his head like a pebble between his teeth. The Riverside building crouched by the waterline. A long, low structure of weathered gray boards on a stone foundation, roof sagging slightly in the middle. A single row of small high windows dull with grime. Tufts of grass and last summer's weeds clung to the packed dirt around it, their stalks darkened by the drizzle. The river beyond moved slow and brown, shouldering past rocks slick with moss. Walter killed the engine. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. The shepherd shifted in the passenger seat, turning his head toward the building, nostrils flaring. "Smells like mildew and bad decisions, huh?" Walter muttered. The dog huffed once, an almost laugh, and wagged his tail exactly one time. Walter stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. He shrugged his jacket tighter around him and walked to the chain-link gate set between two leaning posts. A simple padlock hung there, new and shiny against the rusted metal. Marlene had slid it across the diner table with the folder. "You're the only one with a key," she'd said. He fished the key from his pocket now, feeling the familiar weight of his watch against his wrist as he did, and slid it into the lock. It turned with a small metallic click, the kind of sound the army had trained him to notice and file away. He swung the gate open, hinges squealing in protest. The shepherd patted at his heel as he crossed the packed dirt yard toward the front doors. Double wooden panels banded in iron, scarred with decades of use. He didn't have to go inside today. Marlene had said a first walk-around would be enough, just to prove they cared. Still, he laid a hand on the cold wood for a moment, as if feeling for a pulse. The drizzle thickened, tapping on his shoulders, beating on the dog's fur. "All right," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Looks like you and me have one more thing to look after." He traced the line of the foundation with his eyes, noted the crumbling mortar at one corner, the way the ground dipped slightly near the riverside. Nothing dramatic, just the slow surrender of man-made things to time and weather. It should have been just another job, another box to tick on a clipboard. On his way back to the gate, he paused once more to look over his shoulder at the warehouse. The river rolled on, indifferent. Somewhere a crow called. He reached the gate, swung it shut, and fed the chain through the mesh, the padlock cool and solid in his palm. As he snapped it closed, a faint sound brushed the edge of his hearing. A soft, distinct knocking, like knuckles against wood, from deep within the warehouse or perhaps from under its floor. He froze, breath hanging in the damp air, the shepherd's ears flicking forward. The sound did not come again. The dog glanced up at him, eyes steady, as if asking whether this was something they should worry about or simply another ghost in his head. Walter swallowed, the taste of old dust and older memories rising at the back of his throat, and wondered, not for the first time, how much of what he heard these days belonged to the present, and how much was just his past refusing to stay buried. The next morning broke clear and pale, the kind of mountain light that made the frost on the grass glitter like someone had scattered ground glass across the trailer park. Walter stepped out onto his small wooden stoop, jacket pulled tight against the bite in the air, and drew in a slow breath that tasted like cold metal and pine. Behind him, something bumped gently against the screen door, impatient but polite. "Hold your horses," he muttered without turning. When he did look back, Ranger was there, filling the doorway. The German shepherd stood poised, weight balanced on strong forelegs, tail swaying in a small, controlled arc. At 7 years old, he had settled into a kind of dignified solidity, the gangly edges of youth worn into muscle and memory. Brown eyes watched Walter's face as if reading more than the sleep lines and gray stubble, as if checking the shadows behind his gaze. The dog's left flank, where a thin scatter of pale scars marred the otherwise thick sable coat, rose and fell with an easy, steady breath. Walter reached automatically for the collar, a plain strip of worn brown leather, and clipped on the leash. "Dreams weren't so bad," he told the dog, as if answering a question Ranger had asked. "You can stand down." Ranger simply blinked, then leaned his head forward just enough that his forehead brushed briefly against Walter's wrist, a touch so light it could have been accidental. It wasn't. The van's engine coughed twice before catching. Frost melted in streaks down the windshield as the defroster chugged valiantly. Walter guided them out of the gravel lot and onto the main street, Maple Hollow just waking up. A kid on a bicycle pedaling toward the school bus stop, a woman in her 50s in a bulky parka scraping ice off her car windows, a man in a ball cap hauling crates into the diner's back door. Ordinary, 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 he told himself, letting the rhythm of the route settle over him like an old coat. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, front paws braced, nose near the open crack of the window, sampling the layered smells of town. Wood smoke, exhaust, the faint yeasty perfume from the bakery. At Mrs. Coleman's, Walter carried a small white paper bag up the 3 concrete steps. the dog padding at his side until the threshold where he stopped without being told, sitting square and still. "Morning, Walter," Mrs. Coleman said as she opened the door, cardigan half-buttoned over a faded floral dress. Up close, the late 70s in her posture were more obvious. Shoulders rounded, fingers slightly curled with arthritis, but her sharp blue eyes missed very little. She peered past him. "And morning to you, soldier." Ranger flicked his ears, tail brushing once against the stoop. He didn't move forward, but his attention softened, a tiny loosening around his eyes. "BP pills?" "Same as always," Walter said, passing her the bag and waiting while she shuffled to the side table to set it down. Yeah, she muttered, more to herself than louder. "You two are my angels with a van." He felt the old reflexive urge to deflect, to say he was just doing his job, but the way her mouth trembled when she smiled stopped him. "We'll see you next week," he said instead. Back at the van, he scratched Ranger's chest in that one spot that always made the dog's back leg twitch. "You hear that? Angels." Ranger huffed, as if to say he'd prefer a biscuit to theological promotion. They made 3 more stops, all variations on the same theme. A shaky hand taking a signature pad, a story told twice, a TV murmuring too loud in the background. Each time, Ranger adjusted himself to the doorway or porch, never crowding, always close enough that if someone slipped, he'd be there. Walter watched him once or twice, the automatic way the dog's body angled between an elderly woman and a set of icy steps, and thought about sand and gunfire and a younger version of himself giving hand signals in the dark. Different war, same instincts. By late morning, the sun had burned off the frost, leaving the world damp and shining, puddles in the potholes reflecting the sky in broken, trembling pieces. Walter checked the list on his clipboard and saw a gap between deliveries. Enough time for one more stop, that other obligation pressing at the edge of his mind since he'd locked the gate the evening before. Ranger must have felt the change in his grip on the wheel. The dog lifted his head and looked at him, ears tipping forward as the van turned off the main road and onto the narrower lane that led to the river. "Just a quick check," Walter said aloud, mostly for his own benefit. "Make sure no kids decided to play explorers." The riverside warehouse came into view, hunched in gray against the strip of muddy bank. In the clear light of day, with no drizzle blurring the edges, it looked less like something out of a story and more like what it was, an old building that had outlived its purpose. The river slid past, brown and implacable. Walter parked by the gate, cut the engine, and sat for a moment longer than necessary, fingers resting on the keys. The memory of that soft knocking from the night before brushed the back of his neck. So faint he could have imagined it, but sharp enough to have followed him into sleep. Ranger whined once, very low, a question wrapped in concern. "I know," Walter said. "Probably just the board settling, or a raccoon with bad timing." But when he stepped out of the van, he realized his shoulders were tighter than they needed to be, his boots a little too loud on the gravel. He unlocked the gate, metal clicking in the quiet. As he swung it open, Ranger slipped through at his heel, tail held at a neutral half-mast, head moving slowly side to side as he smelled the yard. They crossed the bare ground together, Walter's eyes tracing the lines of the building again, checking for broken windows. New graffiti, any sign of forced entry. Nothing. Just the soft squelch of the damp earth and the faint slap of water against the river stones. He was about to turn back when Ranger stopped dead. The leash went taut, biting gently into Walter's palm. The dog's head was up, ears pricked forward now, body oriented not toward the doors or the walls, but toward a patch of weeds near the corner of the foundation. where last year's tall grass had collapsed into a matted, tangled nest. "What is it?" Walter asked, though he trusted the answer more than his own senses. Ranger took 2 steps forward, then another, the leash pulling in small, insistent jerks. When Walter loosened his grip a fraction, the shepherd surged ahead, nose to the ground, inhaling deeply. Then he began to dig. For such a large, composed animal, the intensity of it was startling. Dirt and dead grass flew in short, efficient bursts, his front paws working like pistons, claws scraping against something that was not soil. The sound, a higher rasping scrape, sent a little spark down Walter's spine. "Hey, hey," Walter said, kneeling to catch the dog's collar. "Easy, big guy. You'll break a nail, and then where will we be?" Ranger ignored the joke, snorting once and pawing at the exposed edge of whatever lay beneath. Walter brushed him gently to the side and used his gloved hands to clear away the rest of the debris. Under the churned-up grass and thin layer of dirt, a line of stone appeared, the edge of a step, old and worn, leading down into the ground at a shallow angle. Set into the soil just below it was a metal ring, dull with rust but still solid, attached to a board that didn't quite match the surrounding earth. A hatch, his mind supplied, with the dry calm of someone accustomed to evaluating risk. He sat back on his heels, heart beating a little too fast for the mild exertion. The November air suddenly seemed to thicken, the smell of wet earth intensifying as he wrapped his fingers around the ring. Ranger stood close enough that Walter could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the dog's breath warm against his sleeve. "You sure about this?" Walter asked softly, not sure whether he was talking to the dog, the building, or the part of himself that always seemed to steer him toward trouble instead of away from it. Ranger didn't bark. He simply leaned in, bringing his shoulder against Walter's arm, eyes fixed on the half-hidden rectangle of wood as if it were a door in time itself. Walter pulled. The hatch came up with a reluctant creak, hinges protesting, a small puff of colder air rising from the dark below. The smell hit him then. Old wood and damp stone, a hint of metal and something else he couldn't quite name, like paper that had soaked up too many years. It was not the sour reek of rot, more like the breath of a closed chapel or a forgotten attic. He stared into the shadowed opening, throat suddenly dry. The question he'd been circling since last night pressing hard against his ribs. Was he about to pry open one more mess he couldn't clean up? Or had he just found the one hidden thing that might finally let him set something right? The darkness under the hatch wasn't the wild, empty dark of the woods at night. It was denser, quieter, a darkness that had been sitting in one place for a very long time. Walter let the hatch rest open, waited for his eyes to adjust, then felt along the inside wall for steps. His fingers brushed smooth wood, edges worn down, and he exhaled slowly. Someone had meant for people to come and go here. "Stay," he told Ranger out of habit, then, after a beat, added, "Close, but stay." The dog's nails clicked on the boards as he settled at the edge of the opening, head lowered, watching. Walter descended carefully, boots testing each step before committing his weight, one hand on the wall, the other steadying the flashlight he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. The beam cut through dust motes, revealing a short staircase that opened into a round room. When he reached the floor, he had to stop. It wasn't what he'd expected. No crates, no tools, no rows of forgotten furniture. The room was maybe 15 feet across, the floor made of tight-fitted wooden planks that gleamed faintly under the light, rubbed by countless footsteps into a soft sheen. The walls curved up around him, also wood, but carved, patterns of trees rising from the baseboards, their trunks twisting into branches that became rivers, that became hills, that looped around and back into roots. He turned slowly in place, the beam tracing the relief. A pine stand he recognized from the ridge above town. The sweep of the river as it bent around the old mill. This wasn't just decoration. It was a map and a prayer rolled into one. A simple bench ran along one section of wall, its surface smooth and inviting, the kind of place where someone might sit with hands folded, not to count inventory, but to count breaths. In the center of the room stood a small wooden table, sturdy and unadorned, and on it, a neat stack of notebooks bound in worn brown leather. The air down here was cool and dry, tinged with the faint scent of cedar and paper instead of mold. It felt, Walter realized, less like a storage cellar and more like a chapel that had decided to go underground. Above him, at the top of the stairs, Ranger's silhouette filled the hatch opening, ears pricked, tail hanging still. "It's okay," Walter called softly, though he wasn't completely sure yet. "Nothing's jumping out." The reassurance was as much for himself as for the dog. He stepped to the table and picked up the top notebook. The leather was cracked but still soft under his fingertips. Inside the front cover, in careful block letters that had once been bold and now had faded only slightly with time, a name stared up at him. Jonas Kirby. The words hit him with a jolt almost physical. For a second, he saw not the neat handwriting, but a face from 20 years back. Mid-40s then, broad-shouldered in turnout gear, square jaw smudged with soot, sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, gray eye blazing with tired humor as he'd stood in front of the station holding a melted helmet for the local paper's camera. Jonas, the town's gold-plated hero until he wasn't. "You've got to be kidding me," Walter murmured. His voice sounded small in the carved room. Everybody in Maple Hollow knew how the story ended. The factory fire on the edge of town, the one that had lit the night sky orange for hours. Rumors about sprinklers turned off, exits chained, management cutting corners. Jonas had been the incident commander, the one on the radio, the one on the news afterward when they needed someone to blame. They said he'd hesitated, misread the structure, cost 3 workers their lives. The company, Northline Resources, had stood at the memorial in shining suits and somber ties, shaking their heads, saying all the right words. Jonas had lasted 6 months under the weight of it before his truck was found by the gorge, empty. No one ever found him. Walter swallowed, thumb resting on the edge of the page. For years he'd filed Jonas under the same mental cabinet as himself. Men who made the wrong call, men whose ghosts wouldn't shut up. But standing in a secret room Jonas had built, or at least claimed, warped the edges of that belief. He sat slowly on the bench and opened the notebook. The first entries were ordinary enough. Dates, weather, small-town observations, a note about the sound of the river in winter, louder in some underground channel. Then the tone shifted. Names, numbers, diagrams of pipes and holding ponds, acronyms Walter recognized as regulatory agencies. Northline Resources appeared again and again, underlined once, then twice. Phrases leaped out. Waste release, unreported spill, workers sick, tests doctored. Jonas hadn't just come down here to pray. He'd been watching, gathering, building a case that never made it to daylight. Walter set that notebook down, hands a little unsteady, and noticed for the first time that the table legs were thicker than they needed to be. He knelt, ran his fingers along the underside, and felt a slight ridge. An inset panel. A light push, a soft click. and a small drawer slid out from the apron of the table, flush with the side. Inside lay a canvas bag, the color of old bones, tied with a fraying cord. Ranger's paws sounded on the stairs then, the dog unable to tolerate the distance any longer. He descended, pausing on the last step, nose testing the air. Walter glanced up at him. "If this is a nest of spiders, you're going to have to pretend I didn't whimper," he said, voice dry. Ranger's tail twitched once, a quiet encouragement. "Go on." Walter lifted the bag onto the table and loosened the cord. The smell that came out was unmistakable. Ink, cotton paper, that strange faint sweetness money carried when it had sat undisturbed. Inside were bank envelopes, fat with cash, and beneath them a bundle of documents bound with a rubber band, savings, bonds, some older than Walter, some newer, all in names he didn't recognize. At the very bottom lay a single folded letter, the paper creased soft from being opened many times. The name, "To whoever finds this after I'm gone," on the outside in the same careful hand. His chest tightened. He unfolded it. The letter was dated 15 years ago. Jonas's voice came off the page in lines that were straighter than Walter would have expected from a man in that much trouble. But the anger bleeding through was unmistakable. He wrote about the factory fire, about safety systems bypassed to save North Line money, about reports he'd tried to file that had vanished on someone's desk, about being told, point blank, that if he wanted to retire with his pension, he'd sign the papers that made the whole thing his fault. He refused, and they came for him anyway. They called it an honorable resignation. Then he wrote about the river, about dead fish floating belly up after a minor leak, about kids coughing after swimming downstream. He'd started going through dumpsters, following trucks at night, photographing shipments. And one day, he wrote, he found the account ledgers, proof that Northline was siphoning money from safety budgets, paying off inspectors, setting aside a slush fund to cover fines that never came. They stole from the people who work for them, and from the ground they stand on, Jonas had scrawled, the lines growing darker, more jagged. So I took some of it back, not all. Not enough for them to notice right away. Enough to matter to the right hands. The cash, the bonds, blood money, he called it, was to be used for the town, for the river, for the families who'd lost paychecks and health to Northline's greed. He'd hidden it here, along with years of notes, because he didn't trust anyone in an office or a suit to do the right thing. "If I'm gone when you find this," the last paragraph read, "I hope you're braver than I might manage to be in the end." Walter finished and sat back, the bench taking his weight with a soft creak. The room seemed to press closer around him, the carved trees on the walls leaning in like they were waiting for his verdict. Ranger moved to his side and rested his head on Walter's knee, warm weight anchoring him to the present. "What the hell am I supposed to do with this, Jonas?" Walter whispered. It was one thing to be haunted by your own mistakes. Being handed someone else's unfinished business, along with a pile of stolen, at some point money, was another. He stayed there a long moment, then gathered the notebooks and the letter into his arms, leaving the cash and bonds where they were. Money had teeth. The story needed to be understood before he dared touch it. There weren't many people in Maple Hollow he'd trust with something like this. In fact, he could think of exactly one. The bell over the door of Ward's Books chimed softly when he stepped inside. That afternoon, Ranger padding close behind, the winter light from the street slanting in over shelves of unevenly stacked paperbacks and hardcovers. The store was narrow but deep, with mismatched lamps casting puddles of yellow over comfortable, sagging chairs. It smelled like old pages, cinnamon tea, and a hint of orange oil furniture polish. Behind the counter, Evelyn Ward looked up from a catalog. She was 62, maybe, with silver hair cut in a pragmatic bob that still managed to curve around her jaw in a way that softened its sensible angles. Fine lines fanned from the corners of her green-gray eyes, more from smiling than frowning, though there was a bunkered-down tiredness there, too. A faded denim shirt hung loosely over a dark skirt, and a pair of reading glasses dangled from a chain at her neck. She'd been Maple Hollow's librarian for decades, before the county restructured the budget and the brick library closed. She'd poured her severance and stubbornness into this second-hand shop. "Walter," she said, and there was genuine warmth in it. "You're early for your usual Friday raid on the mystery section." Her gaze dipped to the leather-bound stack in his hands, the tightness in his shoulders, then to Ranger, who was standing very still, eyes sweeping the room as if cataloging exits. "And you brought homework?" "You're the only one I know who actually likes that word," he replied. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Got a minute?" "For notebooks smuggled in by a decorated delivery man and his bodyguard?" she said. "Always." He followed her to a small table near the back, by a window that overlooked the street. Ranger lay down where he could see both them and the door, chin on his paws, but his eyes never quite stopped moving. Walter laid the top notebook and the letter on the table. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and began to read. He watched her face change as she flipped pages, curiosity first, then a growing stillness, then a tightening around her mouth that he recognized as anger, restrained not because she wasn't entitled to it, but because she didn't want to spill it carelessly. When she got to the letter, she read more slowly, lips pressing together on certain lines. By the time she set it down, the skin around her eyes was shiny, but no tears had fallen. "Jonas Kirby," she said softly. "They buried him twice, didn't they? Once in the papers and once wherever his body ended up." Walter swallowed. Seems he was trying to dig himself back out. "And dig us out with him," she added, fingertips resting lightly on the journal's edge. "North Line poisoned that river, and half this town still pretends it was just a bad year for fish." Before he could answer, a low rumble came from near his feet. Ranger's lips hadn't lifted, but a quiet growl vibrated in his chest, directed not at Evelyn or the shelves, but at the front of the shop. Walter turned slightly, following the dog's gaze through the glass. Across the street, a black SUV sat at the curb, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see inside. It had been there when he arrived, he now realized, though he'd barely registered it. Evelyn's eyes flicked from the vehicle back to the notebooks, then to Walter, something steely settling beneath the sadness. "That car's been out there a while," she said in a low voice. "Longer than it takes to buy a sandwich at the cafe." Ranger's growl faded into a tense silence, his ears pricked, tail stiff like an arrow. Evelyn drew a slow breath, straightened her glasses, and asked, almost conversationally, but with a weight that landed squarely in the center of his chest, "Do you think they already know what we've just uncovered, Walter? Or are we the first ones to realize what Jonas left behind?" Sleep came in fits that night, thin and patchy, like clouds skimming too fast across a winter moon. Walter dozed on the narrow bed in his trailer, the hum of the small heater and the distant rush of the river trying to sand down the sharp edges of the day. Somewhere in the gray space between dreams, he saw Jonas's name again, ink on paper, and Evelyn's eyes over her glasses, steady and sad. He didn't realize he'd gone under fully until the sound ripped him back. Ranger's bark, deep and explosive. Not the casual woof of a dog annoyed at a raccoon, but the full-bodied alarm of an animal who has just decided something is wrong. Walter jerked upright, heart thudding, breathing already fast in that old automatic pattern his body remembered from other lives. The clock said 1:14 a.m. Ranger stood at the small trailer window, front paws on the sill, hackles raised along his spine like a row of stiff bristles, teeth bared toward the direction of the river. He glanced back at Walter, eyes bright and unwavering, then barked again, shorter this time, almost a command. Okay, Walter muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He grabbed the red and black jacket from the hook, his flashlight from the crate by the door, and shoved his feet into his boots without bothering with socks. Outside, the cold hit like a slap, sharp, clean, full of stars. The air smelled of frost and wood smoke and, faintly, the damp tang of the river. He opened the van's side door, and Ranger leaped in, muscles coiled, nails clicking on the metal floor. The drive down to the warehouse took less than 5 minutes, but each bend in the road seemed to stretch. As he crested the last rise, he cut his headlights. Letting the night swallow most of the van, the yard beyond the gate was not dark. Thin blades of light knifed through the gaps in the warehouse siding, jittering as they moved. Voices carried too, male, rough, layered with annoyance and something uglier. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. So much for maybe it's just a raccoon. He parked on the shoulder, heart doing that peculiar double beat that meant fear and anger had decided to hold hands. At the gate, he paused long enough to slip the bolt and ease it open. "Heel," he murmured. Ranger came to his side, close enough that Walter could feel the warmth of him through denim, the dog's breathing steady but alert. They crossed the yard quickly, boots soft on packed dirt, until they were close enough that the words from inside were clear. "Has to be in here somewhere," a man snarled. "Old man Kirby didn't dig a church down there for nothing." Another voice, a little higher, a little more nasal, answered, "I'm telling you, boss, said the money never made it to the books. You think they're gonna be happy if we come back empty-handed again?" There was a crash like a crate being overturned, followed by the metallic rattle of something heavy hitting the floor. Walter felt heat rise in his chest. They were in Jonas's room, in the one place that felt like a promise. He pushed the warehouse door open with more force than he meant to. It slammed back against the wall, the sound cracking through the space like a gunshot. 2 flashlight beams snapped toward him, blinding for a second, then swung down. The men holding them were about mid-30s. The one closest, broad-shouldered, thick neck, dark hair shaved close to his skull, wore a black security jacket stretched a little tight over a softening belly. His square face was unshaven, his mouth twisted into a smirk that didn't reach his small, pale eyes. The other was narrower, wiry, with a long, sharp nose and a mustache that looked like it had given up halfway through growing. His brown hair stuck up in different directions, as if he'd been pulling at it. Both had laminated badges clipped to their belts with the logo of a private security firm out of Crestline. "Evening, gentlemen," Walter said, voice too flat to pass for friendly. "You lost?" The broad one snorted. "We're exactly where we're paid to be, old man." He swept his light around again in a showy arc, illuminating scattered boxes, a broken pallet, a coil of rope. "Private security detail, property of Northline. You?" "Caretaker," Walter replied. The word tasted strange in his mouth. "Town council asked me to keep an eye on this place until the sale's final." "Yeah, we heard." The wiry man's grin was thin and mean. "Local hero of the grocery run, right? Thought you'd be tucked in by now." Ranger moved a step forward, placing his body just ahead of Walter's leg, weight distributed evenly, tail low but not tucked. His growl was a low current, audible only because the warehouse had gone very quiet. Broad shoulders lifted his flashlight like a weapon. "Call your mutt off." "He's fine," Walter said. "You two, on the other hand, are trespassing." "Big word," the wiry one sneered. "Look, Grandpa, here's how this is gonna go." He took a step closer, breath sour with whatever he'd been drinking before his shift. "Your buddy Kirby hid company assets down there, and assets belong to North Line. Boss man wants them back. You help us find what's his, we all go home. You don't," Broadchest picked up smoothly. "You don't, and this whole sweet little town loses its shot at a nice fat purchase. Maybe the plant moves, maybe the jobs go, what's left of them. Maybe we mention how you interfered with official security personnel. Could get real uncomfortable for you. For everyone." The words sank like stones in Walter's gut. They were bluffing, probably, but the general shape of the threat was true. Northline had big lawyers and longer reach. The council desperately wanted the sale. But Jonas's letter was a weight in his memory. Money stolen from the town, not by a firefighter, but by the people these clowns worked for. "What Jonas took wasn't company assets," Walter said quietly. "It was restitution. You don't own the river you poisoned." Broad-Shoulder's face darkened. "We're not here to debate philosophy." He jabbed a finger toward the rear of the building. "You know where it is? That hatch. You and the librarian. You think we don't watch who goes in and out?" So they'd noticed him and Evelyn after all. His mouth went dry. "You lay a hand on her. You gonna stop us?" The wiry one stepped in close enough that his chest bumped Walter's. "You and your old dog?" It was a mistake. Not the words, the proximity. When his hand came up, shoving Walter hard in the shoulder, years of training he thought he'd buried flared to life. Walter staggered back a half step, caught his balance. But before he could decide whether to swing or walk, Ranger made the decision for him. The shepherd launched forward, not for the man's throat, but for his arm, teeth closing just short of flesh, grabbing jacket and muscle in a grip that said enough. The wiry man yelled, yanking back, flashlight spinning out of his hand and skittering across the floor. Broad Shoulders lunged toward Walter, who twisted, shoved him offline. The three of them collided with a stack of old lumber, boards clattering down around their feet. Somewhere in the tangle of limbs, a small object flew. Metal glinted, and a second later, the sharp crash of glass shattered the air. Walter smelled the oil before he saw the flame. The kerosene lantern that had been perched on a crate nearby, a stupid leftover from whoever used this place last, hit the floor in a spray of burning fuel. Fire licked eagerly up a plank, then another, tasting dry wood, finding decades of dust, accelerating with terrifying, hungry speed. "Out!" Walter's voice snapped through the chaos. Training overrode everything now. He grabbed the wiry man's collar with one hand, Broad Shoulders' sleeve with the other, dragging them toward the door as they stumbled and cursed. Heat rolled up his back. Smoke thickened in his throat. Ranger backed with them, barking sharply, hurting as much as retreating, snapping at the air as if he could bite the fire itself. They burst into the night, coughing, shirts streaked with soot. The glow inside the warehouse flickered brighter, orange tongues probing gaps between boards. Walter shoved the two men farther into the yard. "Call it in," he rasped, already reaching for his phone. By the time the volunteer fire crew and the county deputies arrived, the blaze had chewed through an entire wall. They contained it before it jumped to the trees. But the warehouse gaped blackened and smoking, its secrets cooked. Walter gave his statement sitting on the back bumper of his van, Ranger pressed against his knee, the dog's fur smelling faintly of smoke. He stuck to the facts. Intruders, confrontation, accidental lantern break, evacuation, 911. The deputies took notes, faces unreadable. The two guards clutched ice packs to their bruises and glared. Morning brought a different kind of fire. The sun was barely up when a sleek sedan with city plates rolled into the gravel lot outside the sheriff's office. The woman who stepped out was in her late 40s, tall and spare, with a severe black suit that fit like armor and a neat twist of dark hair at the nape of her neck. Her face was narrow, lips thin, eyes a cool, assessing blue behind rimless glasses. She carried a leather briefcase and the faint, expensive scent of someone who never had to step into a warehouse at 1 a.m. "Mr. Harris," she said an hour later, in the small interview room that smelled faintly of coffee and old linoleum. Her voice was smooth as polished steel. "I'm Caroline Price, legal counsel for Northline Resources." She sat across from him, back straight, hands folded neatly on a manila file. "Our security personnel report that you entered the property after hours and physically assaulted them, resulting in injury and significant damage. Northline takes such incidents very seriously." "Your men were tearing the place apart in the middle of the night," Walter replied, fatigue making his own voice sandpapery. "They laid hands on me first. The fire was an accident." "An unfortunate one," she agreed crisply, "and one the insurance company will be very interested in. The fact remains, you had no authority to confront them in that manner. The town contract regarding caretaking does not supersede Northline's rights as the pending buyer." She slid a paper across the table. "This is the incident report we'll be filing. It reflects our position that you initiated the altercation." Walter glanced at it, the words swimming. Trespassing, aggression, non-compliance. Each term heavy with a weight that could crush him if Northline chose to sit on it. The sheriff, the same man who'd coached his son's Little League team 20 years back, now in his late 60s with a paunch, thinning gray hair, and a face mapped with permanent worry lines, stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. Sheriff Doug Miller looked tired, and under the tired, guilty. Outside, Walter could hear Ranger pacing in the back of the van, where they'd been told to leave him. The occasional soft whine threading through the hallway noise. After the lawyer left, Doug stepped in fully and shut the door with a soft click. "Walt," he said, lowering himself into the chair Caroline had vacated. His voice had the rumble of gravel in it. "Off the record, you kicked a hornet's nest last night." "I called in a fire and kept 2 idiots from burning to death," Walter said. "You think I should have let the place go up with them inside?" Doug's mouth twisted. "You know that's not what I'm saying." He rubbed a hand over his face. Up close, the broken veins at the sides of his nose were more obvious, the telltale mark of a man who poured 1 extra at night to sleep. Northline's got lawyers stacked 3 deep, and the town's hanging on this sale by a thread. They're already talking about lawsuits, about pulling out, about claiming hostile environment. We don't have the budget for that fight. "So you want me to sign something," Walter said slowly. "Say I overreacted, that I'm sorry." Doug held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away first. "I'm saying maybe the best thing you can do, for yourself, for everyone, is let this one go. No more poking around the warehouse, no more stirring up old ghosts. Sometimes the smart move is to step back." Walter stared at the scuffed tabletop. His reflection in the metal edge was a warped smear of red and black and gray. He thought of other fires, other reports written so the wrong man carried the blame. He thought of Jonas's careful handwriting in that underground room, of the line that said, "I hope you're braver than I managed to be in the end." Ranger's faint whine carried through the wall again, a small thread of sound that tethered him to something simpler than politics. Hurt and help, threat and protection, wrong and right. If I let it go, he said quietly, more to himself than to Doug, and pretend none of this happened. Am I really keeping the peace? Or just going back to being the kind of man who can't stand his own eyes in the mirror? By the end of the week, Maple Hollow felt like it was holding its breath for a future it hadn't asked for. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards and taped crookedly to the windows of the diner and post office. Glossy renderings of a sleek new processing plant by the river. Smiling silhouettes of workers in hard hats. Bold letters promising jobs, growth, opportunity. In smaller, denser type were the phrases that made Walter's stomach knot. River channel improvements. Selective forest clearing. Urban renewal zone. Folks repeated the words they wanted to hear and skipped the rest. On his delivery rounds, he heard the same refrain in different voices. At Mrs. Hanley's tiny house, the 80-year-old with the oxygen tube and permanent blue cardigan patted his hand with her papery fingers and said, "Maybe my grandson will come back from Portland, if there's real work here again." Outside the hardware store, two men in their 40s argued, one nervous about the river, the other snapping, "You got a better idea to keep this town alive?" At the edge of Main Street, a faded "for sale" sign had been joined by a fresh orange notice, stapled to the pole outside Evelyn's shop. Public hearing, proposed redevelopment. Walter saw it as he was unloading a crate of donated paperbacks from the van, the bright paper shouting over the hand-painted "Ward's Books, Used and Loved" sign above the door. Evelyn stepped out, a cardigan wrapped tight around her narrow shoulders, despite the mild day. Her silver hair twisted into its usual loose knot. The lines around her mouth were deeper than usual. "They posted it this morning," she said quietly, nodding at the notice. Her voice was even, but her hands kept smoothing the edge of the cardigan like she needed something to do with them. "If the project goes through, this whole block's in the renewal zone." Charming code word for knocking things down. "They don't build bookstores in their pretty pictures," Walter said. He tried to put some lightness in it, but it landed flat between them. Evelyn huffed a humorless little laugh. "No, they don't. Libraries either. Funny that." Ranger stood between them on the sidewalk, tail giving a slow, uncertain wag, as if trying to bridge a gap he couldn't see. He leaned his head briefly against Evelyn's hip, and she absent-mindedly scratched his ears, the way you'd reach for a handrail without thinking. When a truck rolled by, radio blaring a segment about economic revival, she dropped her hand. "I don't blame people for wanting jobs," she said. "I just wish the bill wasn't always paid by the same river and the same kind of people." Her gaze flicked to the manila envelope half tucked under Walter's arm, the one with copies of Jonas's notes, the one he hadn't yet decided what to do with. Then she looked away, giving him the mercy of not asking. "I have a story hour in 10, she said, instead. "Kids from the church daycare. Might as well fill their heads with dragons and brave rabbits while we still have shelves." When she turned back inside, the bell over the door jingled in that thin, familiar way. Ranger watched her go, then looked up at Walter, eyes questioning. Walter didn't have an answer. That afternoon, the rain came in slow, steady sheets, turning the dirt road by the river into a ribbon of mud. Walter parked the van at the broad curve just past the warehouse, its scorched wall now covered in tarps, and walked down to the bank, the canvas bag Jonas had left tucked under his jacket, heavy against his ribs. Ranger stayed close, picking his way around puddles, ears pricked, nose sampling the damp air. They found a flat rock that jutted out a little over the water, slick with moss but solid. A kind of natural pew facing the gray-green current. Walter eased himself down with a small grunt, joints protesting, and set the bag in his lap. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening to the hiss of rain on the river and the occasional drip from the branches overhead. The world narrowed to the cool weight of canvas under his hands and the warm weight of fur against his thigh as Ranger settled beside him, leaning in until their shoulders touched. Finally, Walter opened the bag. Inside, the numbers stared back at him in neat, accusing stacks. Bills bound with rubber bands gone brittle at the edges, a packet of old savings bonds, a ledger page Jonas had scrawled conversion notes on in shaky pen. Walter did quick, rough math in his head, because some part of him refused to put it on paper where it might become too real. It was enough. Enough for a down payment on a little house somewhere coastal, maybe, where the air smelled of salt and not solvent, where the loudest noise at night was waves and not old nightmares marching in formation. Enough to sell the van, settle his debts, find a town where nobody knew his name, or what he'd failed to do 20-odd years ago in a burning building halfway around the world. The idea unfolded like a map he'd never let himself look at closely. Mornings walking a different beach with Ranger, afternoons fixing up a place that didn't creak with other people's memories. Evenings where the only paperwork was junk mail addressed to current resident. No Jonas, no Northline, no council meetings with bad coffee and worse compromises. No watching Evelyn box up her life's work because he couldn't stop a machine with deeper pockets than God. Ranger shifted, resting his chin squarely on Walter's knee, eyes tilted up. They were the same eyes Walter had looked into on a different night under a different kind of smoke. When a young handler had pressed a leash into his hand and shouted over mortar fire, "If I don't get back, you get him out, yeah?" The handler hadn't gotten back. Walter had. He'd led the dog through rubble and noise because leaving him there would have been another name on the list he couldn't live with. "What do you think?" Walter asked softly now. "You ready to learn how to chase gulls instead of trouble?" Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his gaze flicked from Walter's face to the open bag, then out over the water. His ears twitched at a distant sound. Maybe a truck on the far road, maybe nothing. But his body stayed pressed to Walter's side, steady as a post. In that quiet, other faces rose up. Mrs. Hanley, smiling through the oxygen mask as she unwrapped the blood pressure cuff he'd picked up at the clinic sale. The little boy at the bus stop who always insisted on feeding Ranger a single carrot stick from his lunchbox, solemn as a priest giving communion. The teenage girl behind the diner counter, whose whispered thank you the night Walter had driven her home when her ride had forgotten, had stuck with him longer than it should have. Evelyn standing among her shelves, running her fingers along spines the way some people touched stained glass. And Jonas, not the disgraced figure from the town's rumors, but the man on those journal pages, exhausted, angry, clinging to the belief that someone had to draw a line somewhere, even if it cost them everything. Evelyn's sigh floated back to him, the way she'd said, "I just wish the bill wasn't always paid by the same river and the same kind of people." Jonas's cramped handwriting layered over it. "I hope you're braver than I managed to be." Walter blew out a long breath that seemed to take 3 decades with it. His fingers tightened on the canvas until his knuckles ached. "You know," he murmured to Ranger, voice rough, "if I run now, I'm not leaving the war. I'm just changing the weather." For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he was about to give up. Not just the dream of a quiet seaside porch, but the illusion that at 60 he could still choose not to care without it meaning anything. Then he closed the bag, firmly, like sealing a wound. He stood, knees protesting again, but the motion felt cleaner this time, less like fleeing and more like stepping into a hard, necessary march. Ranger rose with him in one fluid movement, shaking rain from his coat, droplets catching the dull light. Walter slung the bag over his shoulder, its strap biting into familiar grooves, and looked back at the river, swollen and restless under the slate sky. "All right," he said, "half to the water, half to the dog. We stay. We use this for them, not for us." Ranger's tail thumped once against his leg, a quiet answer. Walking back toward the road, mud sucking at his boots, Walter felt the old tiredness settle deeper into his bones. But under it, something else stirred. Not hope, not yet. More like the memory of what it felt like to stand his ground for reasons that didn't fit on a balance sheet. He scratched Ranger's neck, feeling the ridges of old scars under the fur. "Just you and me against a corporation, buddy," he said, trying for humor and landing somewhere closer to awe. "You think we're out of our minds?" Ranger glanced up at him, eyes steady, as if to say the question had never really been about winning or losing at all. And that was the part that scared Walter more than anything Northline could put in a legal brief. The storm rolled in before midnight, a low growl over the mountains that built into a full-throated roar by the time Walter pulled on his red and black jacket and stepped out into the whipping rain. The wind off the river carried the metallic clank of machinery long before he saw the lights. Harsh white beams cutting through the dark in jerky arcs. Too bright and too many to be just a couple of security trucks. Ranger was already pacing at the door of the trailer, hackles pricked, nose pressed to the crack as if he'd been smelling this trouble building all day. When Walter opened the door, the dog surged out, then stopped to look back, eyes catching a flash of lightning. It felt like a question. "Are we going?" Walter locked the trailer behind him, an old habit, and answered, "Yeah, buddy, we're going." Down by the river, the scene looked like some twisted carnival. Two bulldozers and a pair of excavators hunched by the warehouse like waiting animals, their yellow flanks slick with rain, engines idling in throat-deep rumbles. Portable floodlights threw harsh circles over the muddy ground, turning every raindrop into a streak of light. A handful of figures in hard hats and reflective vests moved through it all, machine operators in their 30s and 40s, faces half hidden by hoods, and 3 security guards in black jackets with Northline stitched on the chest, broad-shouldered, purposeful. One of the bulldozers had already taken a bite out of the old fence, boards splintered like broken teeth. Walter's gut clenched. The injunction he and Evelyn had pushed for wasn't supposed to be heard until morning. But Northline hadn't waited. They never did. "Walter!" Evelyn's voice rose above the engine noise, thinner than the wind, but sharp enough to cut through it. She stood near the torn fence with a small knot of townsfolk, maybe a dozen in all. A retired mechanic with a gut and a gray ponytail. A young mother in a yellow raincoat clutching a cardboard sign in one hand and her umbrella in the other. 2 high school kids in hoodies. Mrs. Hanley's grandson, with his jaw clenched like he'd never been so mad or so scared. They looked like what they were. Tired people in borrowed rain gear and hastily painted slogans, not a force built to stand against metal and money. Their signs wobbled and dripped. Our river, not your toxic ditch. Books, not smoke. No more blood money. Letters bleeding in the rain, but still legible when the light hit. Evelyn was in the center, umbrella forgotten at her side, gray hair plastered to her cheeks, cardigan soaked under a flimsy rain jacket. She held a sign that simply read, "This town is not for sale." The fear was there in the tightness around her mouth. But so was something steely that reminded Walter of the first time he'd seen her stand up to a drunk teenager trying to steal a comic book. Ranger immediately began weaving down the line of people, tail raised, but not, stiff, barking short, sharp warnings toward the machines. then turning to nudge trembling hands with his nose. The young mother jumped at a particularly loud rev of an engine, her cardboard rattling. Ranger bumped her knuckles gently, then leaned his shoulder against her leg until her grip steadied. "Easy, Ranger," Walter called, though the dog seemed to know exactly how hard to push, how much reassurance to offer without getting in the way. He was Walter's moral compass, running on 4 legs through the rain. One of the security guards, a man around 40 with a shaved head, thick neck, and a face already flushed with anger, strode toward the group, rain beating on his jacket. "You folks can't be here," he shouted, voice amplified by the loud hailer in his hand. Up close, Walter could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the wet lashes, the tension in his jaw. Not a monster, just another man on a payroll. "We've got permits and a schedule. Move back behind the tape before someone gets hurt." "You don't have a court order," Evelyn yelled back, surprising even herself with the force in it. "You're jumping the gun." "Ma'am, I don't write the orders," he snapped. "We're authorized to clear this site. Now move." The bulldozer's blade lifted with a hydraulic hiss, then began to push forward, nosing into the remains of the fence. Wooden planks snapped, the sound like bones in the dark. Walter stepped in front of Evelyn without thinking, boots sinking into the churned mud, rain plastering his cream t-shirt to his chest under the open jacket. His military watch, scratched glass gleaming under the floodlights, ticked on his wrist like a tiny metronome counting down to something he didn't want to name. "You go through us. You're on camera doing it," he said, voice low but clear. He jerked his chin toward a teenager at the end of the line, a lanky boy with curly hair and glasses fogged by the rain, holding his phone high. The boy swallowed hard and lifted it higher, the red recording light a small stubborn dot. "And this time," Walter added, "the story doesn't get written just by your lawyers." The guard hesitated, looking back toward the machines where a supervisor, a man in his 50s with a neat beard and an expensive raincoat, stood under an umbrella, checking his watch like this was all an unfortunate delay in an otherwise efficient evening. The bearded man gestured impatiently. The guard turned back, jaw hardening. "Last warning," he barked. "Move!" He shoved at the line, not full force but enough that, in the slick mud, it was too much. Someone's foot slipped. The young mother cried out as she lurched, dragging the teen beside her off balance. Evelyn reached to steady her, and the whole front of the line wavered like a human chain in rough water. Ranger exploded into barking, darting between bodies to put himself between the shoving and the smallest frame he could. See? In the chaos, one of the portable work lights, set up on a flimsy tripod near a patch of dried grass that the rain hadn't yet fully claimed, tipped. It fell in almost slow motion, glass face first into the brittle hay by the fence line. The bulb shattered with a soft pop, and then there was a hiss and a sudden lick of orange where there had only been gray. "Fire!" someone screamed, as if the word itself could push it back. The wind grabbed the newborn flame like a hungry thing, shoving it into the dry patch. It leapt, catching, fingers of fire racing along the base of a scrubby bush and reaching for the low limbs of a pine just beyond. In an instant, the threat changed shape. No longer paperwork and permits, but heat and smoke and the memory of Jonas on the wrong side of both. Walter's lungs compressed, the air around him thickening with ghosts. For a heartbeat, he was somewhere else entirely, under a different sky that had glowed this same ugly orange, shouting into a radio that crackled and died while a building roared. Then Ranger bolted. The dog launched himself toward the fallen light, rain slicking his fur, claws scrambling for purchase in the mud. He grabbed the metal casing with his teeth, dragging it away from the worst of the dry grass, muscles bunching under his coat. The makeshift cord snapped free of its outlet, sparks spitting into the wet ground. The fire still flared, but its main fuel was yanked back, denied. As Ranger turned to pull the light farther, his hind paws slid on a rock hidden beneath the mud. His body slammed hard into a half-buried boulder, the impact dull and sickening even under the storm's howl. He went down with a yelp that sliced through Walter more cleanly than any shrapnel ever had. "Ranger!" Walter's voice broke as he lurched forward, grabbing at the dog's collar. Ranger's sides heaved. One leg splayed at an odd angle, but his eyes were bright, locked on the creeping flames, not on his own pain. He tried to scramble up again, nails scraping, still focused on dragging the light farther from the grass, from the trees. "Easy, boy, easy," Walter muttered, one hand splayed over the dog's ribs, feeling the frantic heartbeat under his palm. The smell of smoke thickened as the fire licked higher up the scrub bush. But the rain was coming harder now, each drop a tiny ally. People were stomping at the edges of the flames with their boots. Someone grabbed a shovel from the back of a truck, beating at the fire line. In the middle of it, Walter made a decision as sharp and hard as the rock Ranger had hit. He let go of the dog only long enough to squeeze his shoulder. "Stay," he said, the old command. But this time it meant, "I need you to live for whatever comes after." Then he ran toward the biggest bulldozer. The machine loomed above him, engine roaring, exhaust belching into the storm. The operator, a man in his 30s with a ball cap under his hard hat and stubble shadowing his jaw, stared down from the cab, eyes wide at the fire and the chaos. Walter grabbed the side rail and hauled himself up the steps, boots slipping, jacket snapping in the wind. He banged on the cab door with the flat of his hand until the man cracked it open, rain and noise rushing in. "You want this on your conscience?" Walter shouted, nodding toward the flames. "Turn off the damn blade and hit the floodlight so folks can see what's really happening." The operator hesitated, looking past Walter at the supervisor under the umbrella, then back at the fire, inching toward the line of trees like a fuse. He reached over and flipped a switch. The bulldozer's mounted speaker system, the same one they used to direct crews over engine noise, squealed, then hummed to life. Walter seized the microphone clipped to the dash. His wet fingers slid over the plastic, but his grip held. From his jacket pocket he pulled his phone, the screen already cued to a file Evelyn had helped him load earlier. Jonas's voice, old and hoarse but clear, laying out dates and payments and the truth about river improvements 3 towns over that had left nothing but sickness. Walter hit play and held the phone to the mic. Jonas's testimony boomed out over the storm, over the engines, over the crackle of fire, and the ragged breathing of the people on the ground. Words about blood money and the same water carrying all our dead spilled into the night, impossible to stuff back into silence. "Evelyn," Walter yelled down toward the line, his voice now riding the speakers. "You live streaming?" She stood beneath one of the floodlights, rain running down her face like tears, phone held high with both hands. Beside her, the curly-haired teen had his own camera up, their screens glowing small and stubborn against the dark. "Yes," she shouted back, her voice trembling but steadying on the second word. "It's going out now. Everywhere." Walter thumbed open the folder in his cloud account, the one he'd spent the last 2 sleepless nights filling with scans of Jonas's bonds and journals, and tapped share, sending the link to Evelyn's phone. Her device buzzed in her hand. On her screen, a notification popped up, then a set of thumbnails. Documents with Northline's name, ledger lines, signatures. She turned her camera so both the fire and the files were in frame. Her voice low but carrying as she said, This is what they're willing to burn a riverbank for, Maple Hollow. This is what they've been doing to towns like ours for decades. Around them, the storm wailed, a raw, relentless backdrop. Jonas's recorded words poured from the bulldozer's speakers. Ranger whimpered softly but kept his eyes on Walter, and the little group of townspeople stood their ground, their wet signs drooping but still held high. In the distance, beyond the curve of the road, a flicker of red and blue tore through the night. The first patrol car, topping the hill, lights strobing against the low ceiling of cloud. For a suspended heartbeat, Walter clung to the bulldozer's rail and watched those lights approach, wondering if the truth in a storm-battered live stream could really outweigh the money that had almost turned this whole riverbank into a funeral pyre. By the time winter loosened its grip on Maple Hollow, the storm on the riverbank had become something else entirely. Paper, files, hearings, headlines. Northline's name, once just a logo on passing trucks, now crawled across national news tickers. Investigations, indictments, words like fraud, toxicity, bribery, spoken in Flat Anchor's voices while footage from that wild, wet night, Evelyn's shaky live stream, played in the corner of the screen. Walter watched some of it from the worn chair in his trailer, Ranger's head heavy on his boot, feeling as if someone had taken the knot in his chest and slowly, methodically, begun to untie it. The bag Jonas had left behind had turned into exhibits and evidence. The old bonds and cash had been traced, the ledgers verified. The voices on the recording matched. The bewildered local cop who'd first taken Walter's frantic statement now sat beside federal investigators, reading from reports under oath. It was as if the town had been living with a bad dream for years and only now discovered it had a filing number in some distant office. When the letter came about the whistleblower award, it was plain white, plain font, absurdly ordinary for what it said. A portion of the penalties in recognition of substantial assistance. Walter read the amount twice, then a third time, the numbers blurring. It was more money than he'd made in the last decade of deliveries and odd jobs. Enough to disappear to some warm coast for real this time, buy a small house where no one knew his name, where no one woke him to talk about war or water or old sins. He set the letter on the table and stared at the ceiling until Ranger nudged his elbow with a wet nose, eyes dark and questioning, as if to ask, "And then what?" The answer came in bits and pieces, like the snow melt that began to swell the river. Evelyn's voice when she talked about losing the bookshop. The way the men from the veterans group hunched their shoulders when they passed Northline's billboard. The empty stretch of riverbank where the warehouse had been, now ringed with temporary fencing and red warning tape. A place that had almost burned, then almost been buried in concrete, now waiting for someone to decide what it would become. In the end, Walter did what he usually did when he didn't know what to do. He drove down to Evelyn's shop with Ranger in the passenger seat and the letter folded neatly in his pocket. The bell over the door chimed, and there she was behind the counter, glasses low on her nose, gray hair pinned in its usual loose bun. A woman in her early 60s with laugh lines that had been working hard these last months to outnumber the worry lines. She looked up, saw his face, and her expression shifted from question to something softer before he even spoke. "They sent this," he said, holding out the letter. He watched her read, watched her brows lift, her mouth press in that way she had when something made her angry and proud at the same time. "It's yours," she said quietly. "You earned it. You and Jonas both." "I don't think it wants to be just mine," Walter replied. "I think it wants to be land, and trees, and maybe shelves." Evelyn blinked, then gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Shelves?" "You said you always wanted more room for the large print section," he said, shrugging, as if they were talking about repainting a wall. "And the vets group has been using the back of the diner. Thought maybe they deserved 4 walls that don't smell like fried onions." That was how the Jonas Kirby Fund was born. Not with a press conference, but at the corner of a bookshop counter, with Ranger wedging his head between their knees as if to insist he be counted in. The lawyers helped set it up. The town council voted. The old warehouse plot went up for auction and was bought by a name that wasn't a corporation, but sounded like a promise. Over the next months, the skeleton of the new place rose where the charred beams and rusted siding had been. Walter watched the work whenever his roots took him past the river. The building was simple, low-slung wood and glass, not trying to impress anyone, just letting the light in. There were benches under wide eaves, a small wing set aside with its own entrance, and a sign that would eventually read, "Counseling and Support for Veterans and Families." And along the path from the parking area, a row of saplings planted by volunteers. Maples, naturally, their slender trunks staked but already reaching for the sky. By early summer, the fences were gone, replaced by flowering shrubs. The dedication day was modest. A few officials in suits, most of the town in their Sunday best, reporters with cameras that Ranger eyed with open suspicion. Walter wore his red and black jacket over a clean cream shirt, boots polished as much as they could be after years of use. He said a few words when they handed him the little plaque with his name on it and Jonas's. He barely remembered them afterward, only that his voice shook least when he mentioned the people who'd worked at the mill, the ones who'd fished this river when it ran clearer. Evelyn spoke too, with the calm warmth of someone who had spent her life putting the right words in the right hands. Then the ribbon was cut, and people flowed in like water, finding its way back to an old channel. Time did the rest. The warehouse stopped being called that. It became the garden, the center, down by the river. Evelyn ran the small library corner like a ship, steering stacks of donated books into the arms of readers. She moved more slowly these days. Her knees complained, she joked. But her mind was quick, her smile quicker. In the afternoons, she could often be found under the young maple near the back fence. Her knitted shawl, soft blue wool, wrapped around her narrow shoulders. A circle of children on the bus, grass at her feet, some 8 or 9, some on the verge of their teens, faces rapt as she read aloud. Ranger lay on his side nearby, a little stiff when he first settled because of the old injury, one hind leg not quite what it used to be. The vet, a compact woman in her 40s with steady hands and a frank manner, had said he'd always have a bit of a limp, but that it wouldn't stop him from doing what mattered. Looking at him now, with 3 kids propped against his warm ribs and one tiny boy tracing his fingers over the pale scar in the fur as if reading Braille, Walter believed her. The old ladies from the senior apartments, mostly in their 70s and 80s, hair in every shade from snow white to stubborn nicotine yellow, had adopted Ranger as a kind of 4-legged grandson. They arrived with pockets mysteriously bulging, producing homemade biscuits and store-bought treats with equal enthusiasm, scolding him half-heartedly about his weight while slipping him just one more when they thought Walter wasn't looking. He pretended to grumble. Ranger pretended to believe him. In truth, watching those wrinkled hands smooth the fur between the dog's ears, hearing their laughter, he felt something like a hole being slowly filled. On days when his delivery routes were light, Walter sat with them. Sometimes he joined a small group of veterans in the counseling room, the walls painted a soft green that made the river outside the windows look like it flowed right through the building. They talked about things they hadn't touched in years, faces, sounds, moments. And if he couldn't find words, he rested a hand on Ranger's collar and listened. and that was enough. Other days, he found himself on the bench beside Evelyn under the maple. Up close, the tree's leaves were the bright, translucent green of new things. The trunk was still thin enough that he could encircle it with both hands, feel the faint roughness of bark just starting to form. "It's going to outlive us," Evelyn said once, her voice not sad but matter-of-fact. She was dressed in a simple dark dress, her gray hair loose for once around her shoulders, the knitted shawl pooled like river water at her elbows. Her face, lined and kind, turned toward the sunlight slanting off the water. "Most of these will," Walter answered. His jacket rustled as he shifted, the old fabric familiar against his neck. His military watch, scratched but sturdy, ticked softly on his wrist. A small, steady heartbeat of metal and time. "Good," she murmured. "Means we did something right for once." Their hands met on the bench between them when they both reached for the same dog-eared gardening catalog. The touch was accidental, but neither of them pulled away immediately. Her fingers were thin, cool. His were rough, warm. Ranger sprawled at their feet, huffed and rolled closer, so his head rested over both their shoes, eyes half closed, as if to pin them there together. They talked then, not about battles fought in distant deserts or the ruin Jonas had tried to repair, but about the practical things that seemed to matter more with each passing year. The woman from Elm Street whose blood pressure was finally under control. The widower who'd smiled for the first time in months during a card game. The teenagers who'd started a river cleanup club because, as one of them had said to Evelyn, "It feels good to fix something that's broken." As the sun slid lower, the river turned to a sheet of muted gold, reflecting a sky that had worn many storms and many clear days. Children's voices drifted from the far side of the garden, where someone had set up a swing between two sturdier saplings. Laughter bubbled up, pure and surprised, every time the swing creaked just a little higher. An old hymn, played on a slightly out-of-tune guitar, floated from the veterans' room. Someone had left the door ajar. Walter watched it all with a quiet that wasn't emptiness anymore, but space, like the rich, dark soil around the base of the maple, ready for roots. He thought of Jonas, of the man carved into the notebook pages, a firefighter who'd tried to carry more than his share, stumbled, then chosen, in the only way he could, to push back against the tide that drowned his town. The money Jonas had stolen and hidden had turned into something he could feel under his boots now. A path, a building, a tree between him and the river. It had turned into a room where men who saw too much could sit and say so. Into shelves where a woman who once thought she'd die behind a closing bookstore could catalog new donations. Into a yard where children and old women leaned against a scarred German shepherd and felt safe. When a breeze came up, carrying the smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of clover, Walter drew it in deep, the way he hadn't dared to in a long time. He looked at Evelyn, at the way her eyes softened when she watched the kids, at the way the lines around her mouth were not just carved by worry, but by years of smiling at strangers who needed directions to the right story. He looked down at Ranger, chest rising and falling in an easy rhythm, the limp hardly noticeable when he shifted to press closer to Walter's boot. "We did all right," Walter said quietly, more to Jonas and the river and the restless part of himself than to anyone else. "We're not rich, but we did all right." Evelyn's hand squeezed his once, a small affirmation. The sky over Maple Hollow blushed into evening, the first stars pricking through. Somewhere a child called to be pushed on the swing one more time. Somewhere a kettle whistled in the center's small kitchen. On the bench, under the young maple, a man in a red and black jacket and a woman with silver in her hair sat with a dog between them and watched a town they loved breathe a little easier. And as Walter rested his palm on Ranger's back and felt the solid, living warmth there, he understood that the true treasure Jonas had left behind was not stacked in vaults or printed on checks, but rooted here in this ordinary, blessed moment. Proof that even a tired man near 60 and a scarred old dog could start again and leave something gentle growing in their wake. Sometimes God's miracles don't look like parted seas or thunder from the sky. Sometimes they look like an old veteran in a red and black jacket, a scarred dog at his side, and a broken town finding its way back to hope. If he can take blood money and turn it into a garden, a library, and a place where lonely hearts feel needed again, he can take whatever is heavy in your life and quietly grow something good out of it too. If this story touched you, would you share it with someone who might need a little hope tonight? Tell us in the comments what you're praying for in this season of your life, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story of grace and second chances. As you click away, I pray that God watches over you and your family, heals the places that still hurt, and reminds you that no matter your age or your scars, He can still use you to plant something beautiful in this world. May the Lord bless you and keep you, today and every day.